A very good morning to all our viewers joining us this morning on this edition of Business7. It's a very, very special occasion, very special edition from my perspective. My name is Toivo Ndjebela, your host, standing in, of course, for Jomari Daddy, who is usually the anchor for this show. I'm saying this edition is special because we are joined by Chantel Husselmann. She's the country senior partner at PwC Namibia, as well as Monique Cloete. She's the managing director of Liberty Life Namibia, to help us dissect really the mid-year budget review policy statement delivered on the 3rd of November by Finance Minister Ipumbu Shimi. Chantel, thank you very much for being here with us this morning.
Thank you for that introduction. Thanks for having me, Toivo,
Sure.
and also a good morning to our online viewers.
Wonderful. Monique, also very much a pleasure to have you here today on this wonderful Friday morning. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Toivo. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Wonderful. So that is the lineup that we have on the show this morning. Very, very exciting. But we will do it this way. So we'll have a conversation with Chantel first, to give us her perspective on that policy statement by the minister, and then afterwards we'll engage Monique also on the same. We'll go for a quick break and then return with Chantel. Thank you for staying with us. We now start our conversation with Chantel Husselmann. She's, like I said in the original introduction, she is a country senior partner at PwC Namibia. Again, a very huge privilege, Chantel, to have you here. The minister's budget, mid-year budget speech was anchored on the theme of boosting resilience and recovery, and I suppose it speaks to the realities of our economy at the moment and what I suppose government wants to do going forward. But to start this conversation, I believe our viewers are eager to know, to receive some sort of digestion of that revised national budget. What can you share with us and the audience, of course, insofar as the country's revenues are concerned?
Thank you, Toivo, and yes, you are correct. That so you mentioned the budget, the mid-year review budget was tabled the 3rd of November,
Yeah.
and ever since the PwC team has been focusing on dissecting that and making information available.
Yes.
So I do consider today's opportunity, or this morning's, just another opportunity
Indeed.
for the business community, but also for fellow Namibians on a household level to gain more insight and understanding into what this means for all of us.
Indeed. Yes.
So to your question, I did bring along some supplementing visuals, which I will switch over to, as it's large figures that I've brought with me. So we would start with outlook in terms of the revenue.
Yeah.
And one can see, starting with the actual outturn for the 2020-21 tax year. So by this time of the year, Toivo, that outlook is readily available, and we also depict it as actual revenue collected, coming in at rounded up to 58 billion.
Yes.
So right next to that would be the original proposed tax revenue to be collected at 52 billion. And then this midterm review gives the opportunity in terms of, is there a downward or upward adjustment required? So positive conversation this time around that the revised revenue is an increase by 2.95%, and then lifting that to 53.6 billion.
Wonderful. That's
so
good
that
news.
would definitely aid us in terms of the final conversation on the budget deficit and debt stock as well.
Sure.
So what is also crucial in understanding and digesting that, so where would the 53 billion be collected from?
Yes.
So Namibia being heavily dependent upon tax revenue as a source of state revenue.
Yeah.
So what we will continue looking at is also a dissect of the various tax streams, and I've brought that along.
Yeah.
So to our viewers, we can see that it is budgeted to collect 29.9% from the SACO revenue pool. So this is a steep drop compared to previous years, but I guess more of that conversation to follow, Toivo, just for our viewers to note.
Yeah.
So that drop in SACO revenue brings that part of the composition equivalent to the budgeted tax revenue from individual taxes. So that will be what me and you refer to as the pay-as-you-earn. So it is budgeted to collect tax revenue from individuals of 29% of the total composition. And then following that would be the budgeted value-added tax revenue to be collected.
Yes, yes.
So that also comes in quite high at 24%, and given the current times where we have a combination of higher unemployment rates equaling less spending power per household as well, meaning less consumption of goods and services on which this specific tax can be collected upon, coupled with having less tourists in the country, Toivo. So you could imagine at times when we had higher levels of tourism, economic activity in the country, all the tourists would consume goods, services while in the country, and that's would have played a significant contribution. So that is the pressure and the stretch in terms of the dissect.
Yes, indeed.
Then my last revenue contributor, the section was the 14% budgeted from company taxes. So that will be including our CCs, our PTYs, our public companies as well. The 14% is a figure that we're quite, in terms of the dissect, familiar with, but it is also the higher that can be, the better for Namibia, as the informal sector can also be pulled into the tax net and just having more contribution on corporate tax in the country.
Yeah, indeed. Chantel, what I find very interesting in your presentation is SACO, because there's been for a very long time a lot being said about how SACO has dropped in terms of its contribution to Namibia in particular, because it's a revenue pool there. But in your presentation, it shows that it's still the biggest chunk, if I read it correctly. It's
29.9, you're right, yes.
Yes, so it's actually still the biggest stream there for government. Just give us an outlook on whether the mid-year budget speech review has seen that contribution dropping or maybe increasing.
That would have been a very good conversation if on the increase. So yes, thanks for the question, Toivo, and it's good to put some visualizing to it as well. So to our viewers, one can see what I've brought along is the actual collection for the prior fiscal year, and you can see that significant drop to what has been given to us through the budget and the revised budget. So a drop of 22 billion down to 14.7 billion. So that is a calculation of a 24% significant drop.
Huge drop.
So how do I interpret, understand that from a layman's view? Is that Namibia being a member country to SACU with the rest of what we call the BLNS countries, Namibia is also then entitled to a share of the collective revenue, customs and excise taxes revenue in the SACU pool. However, it is first for the economic activity to play out within SACU before that allocation is made.
Yes.
So for example, the 22 billion being allocated is the outturn of previous year, of prior year economic activity. And then the same for this year. So due to the lower imports into SACU, and in particularly lower imports into South Africa as a member of SACU, that is the envisaged lower revenue to be allocated to Namibia under the formula in terms of what we are entitled to. So it usually hits us a year after. So it's quite a nervous conversation, and as I recall with Budget Dissect throughout the years, we've always highlighted how vulnerable we are in terms of our exposure or dependency on the SACU revenue pool. So whenever there is significant drop in imports and also significant drop in intra-SACU economic activity, that does bring along significant downwards adjustments, which is putting strain on tax revenue collection. Yes.
Indeed. You spoke about the drop in revenues of SACU related to imports and so forth. Is this, in your observation, maybe just a quick one, is it, does COVID-19 have to do with it?
Yes, definitely. So as I mentioned, considering total imports into SACU as a customs union, with the retraction of the global economy as well, and less trade happening, all of that is still the dire impact of the pandemic. Not be the sole reason, but definitely one can see in terms of the timing by when this reduced allocation will kick in, definitely a major contributor. Yes.
Indeed, the lockdowns and everything, we couldn't send our trucks to South Africa and everywhere else. But thank you for that overview, Chantel. So you spoke about revenue, and revenue is just really one part of the conversation in a bigger picture. Do you mind sharing the revised outlook on the state's expenditure and ultimately the deficit for the 2021-2022 fiscal year?
Yes, so you, as you rightly say, revenue is one side of the conversation. So to the question of how do we anticipate the money to be spent, so just for our viewers, a background would be that it is budgeted under a development budget in terms of infrastructural needs, and then we have the operational budget.
Sure.
So the midterm budget review did include or bring to us that there is an unfortunate upward adjustment in terms of that expenditure outlook. But to start the conversation, was a positive conversation with the reveal of the initial budget in March this year, because expenditure came in at 67 billion versus the actual expenditure of 72 billion of the prior fiscal year. However, that 67 billion is not speaking to current realities, and that is also how useful and the purpose of a country having a mid-year budget review, allowing the Honourable Minister in taking current reality into account. So increased expenditure needs of quantified at around 5 billion were expressed, and with this budget, 2.2 billion thereof will be accommodated. So how is this possible for the government, or the minister? So that would usually be a reallocation as well as increased debt to finance that. So the reallocation is majorly from our development budget and a smaller proportion from the operational budget.
Okay.
So the ministerial reallocations, Toivo, is a lot. That will take up our full hour this morning.
Yeah.
So I can only invite viewers to follow that conversation for example, the various sources, but also the PwC Namibia website, where we have the actual speech as read, as well as supplementing information in terms of the ministerial dissect on the reallocation conversation. And then my concluding remark to your question would be, so the pressure that this increased expenditure budget brings in terms of the revised budgeted deficit. So one can clearly see that increment from 15.8 to 16 billion quantified at a 1.2% increase.
Indeed. Now, Chantel, the one thing that has always been on the lips of every Namibian, including the Minister of Finance, I mean, he's been brave enough to always admit that we have a shortage of funds in the country. I think our borrowing has been an open book. What is Namibia's debt exposure as a result of increasing deficit?
Yes, Toivo, so now that we've touched on the revised increase in our deficit, so that does bring to, so how do we fund this? How can we afford this? And to your question, important for us to know that yes, there's been steep increases in terms of our total debt to GDP the past 5 years, to be specific. Where we currently stand, so before the mid-year budget, it was budgeted at 68.2%, and with this slight increase in deficit, it is now revised to 68.7%. What is also of essence to note is that there will be a composition to the debt stock. So I've just brought along a dissect where our viewers can also be informed in terms of that composition between domestic debt and foreign debt. And just the context to that as well. So for the revised outlook, it is envisaged that the domestic debt levels would remain stable at the 32.8 billion, but whereas a slight increment can be expected in terms of our foreign debt stock from 93 to 94 billion. But to this important conversation, it's key in terms of when there is an increment of total debt stock to consider the country's ability in terms of repaying the debt as per the contractual terms, but also the cost of servicing the debts in the form of finance charges or interest, as me and you would call it. But what was positive to note, Toivo, in the budget speech, that the same day where the revised budget outturn was tabled, also mentioned in the speech by the Honourable Minister, was a significant down payment were made on the Euro bond on the same day. So the figures that I've just given you would exclude that impact because it was the timing of that. But that is it's a positive observation for us as Namibians. Yes,
indeed. Then just a quick one on that. Again, I know that time is not on our side, but is it ideal that your domestic debt is bigger than the foreign debt? Is that the ideal situation that every government wants to be?
So just to reiterate, so for Namibia, what I've given through is that the foreign debt is equivalent to 3 times our domestic debt. So the other way around. What is ideal is the spread, so that there is an element of both as well. And as I said, the bigger conversation to the country would be the ability of us servicing the costs of the debt and actually committing to the contractual terms. Yes.
Indeed. So the minister, during that day on the 3rd of November, also touched on multiple policy priorities and shared progress thereof. What are some of the highlights noted on that front, policy priorities by the minister?
Yes, so the speech were packed with them. I can state to you and to our viewers, so there are 11 of them.
Yeah.
So quite also a good read in terms of catching up in terms of policy development frameworks, what's happening in the country.
Yeah.
I've brought along just 4 contributions to the conversation,
Yes.
but each one of them also has a lot of background and context to be considered.
Yeah.
If I can pause for a moment at the one mentioned there being the Special Economic Zone
Yes.
policy framework.
Yeah.
So that is quite a topical framework currently under stakeholder engagement and review process, as with most of the other policy reforms mentioned. So it's also been an honor for us through ICANN Tax Committee in being a key stakeholder and being allowed to have insight to the framework and giving our comments through.
Yeah.
So this would has the potential of this policy would have the potential of paving the way in terms of having more foreign investment in the country.
Yeah, sure.
And just ease that conversation of how easy it is and how affordable it is in terms of doing business in Namibia.
Yeah, yeah.
So what incentives can be allowed? Specific focus on manufacturers as well, and that's currently an ongoing conversation. As we know, the existing incentives are in a process of being phased out, which is not a positive message to the foreign investment. So much needed policy framework currently being under stakeholder engagement. And then, not on the slide specifically, but recent developments also mentioned per the midterm budget review, being that the Namibian Investment Promotion Bill is soon to be tabled, and my understanding that as yesterday notice has also been given in Parliament on tabling the much needed bill. And in support to that conversation, as recent as last night, we also had the launch of the UNDP Sustainable Development Goals Investment Roadmap. So all of that speaking to having Namibia as a more attractive and incentivized investment opportunity.
Indeed. He also spoke, Minister Shimi, about carbon tax on electrical geysers, which seems to be a new idea in Namibia. What can you share with us in this regard?
So yes, that was the first announcement, but I must give context to how it's to be interpreted with the announcement. Is that it's yet to be researched, and we can also look forward to public input and specific industries in this in the energy renewable space to have their contributions to this conversation. So important considerations in that research would be that taking into account if this goes through, it will go through as an environmental tax. So usually with your environmental tax, it would be a tax that is imposed on the goods, this time the goods being the electrical geysers. So it would be imposed on the geysers at the time of manufacturing, and if it's not manufactured in a specific country, if that's the case for Namibia, then upon importation. So which we currently have, like the carbon emission tax with the importation of vehicles into the country. So this can be a duty then on import. So what it effectively does is it increases the cost of the importer, being our wholesaler or retailer, and that cost would be passed through to the final users, being me and you. So it does pose the risk of having increased pricing in terms of the electrical geysers. So what's important to take into account is that the alternative being the solar geyser option, which is more environmentally friendly because it doesn't use electricity. But if you, a rough estimate is that a 200-liter geyser, let's say 7,000 Namibian dollar if electrical versus 30,000 if solar. So it might be that then both commodities or goods are expensive. By imposing environmental levy on the electrical geyser. That's just speculation and food for thought, and what needs to be considered. What might be a good alternative would considering incentivizing the use of electrical geysers. So you're more influencing consumer behavior on that end.
Yeah, yeah.
Or making it more affordable by providing finance means on a household level,
Yeah.
so that it's not a status symbol or a luxury,
Yes.
but it is a much needed expense when building a new house, for example,
Yeah.
because that will then having the households less reliant on electricity consumption. Yes.
Indeed. Looks like we'll have to start boiling water in the kettles now in order to keep up. But Chantel, we have 2 more questions. Time is running out, but I'm sure this conversation is a good one to have. The Minister also, I mean, a lot of Namibians have waited on, the previously mentioned tax proposals. Did the Minister touch on any of this in his speech?
So yes, all of the pre-announced tax proposals were, or not all, but most of them were covered again with the mid-year budget review.
Yeah.
So it is an indication of the continuation of the conversation. So I did brought along a few of those for our viewers also to follow what that holds for us, but nothing of that is new news.
Yeah.
So also good that there's no increment or new tax being announced this time around, but it was just a continuation of the emphasis that most of these tax amendments still need some further conversation and review and stakeholder input, and that was also quite clearly brought through by the Minister in his speech. For example, in particularly the possibility of introducing a local dividend tax, which will be quite new for Namibia.
Okay.
So legal drafting and the exact wording to have the correct implementation of that is key.
Yeah.
And then on the indirect tax side, there is the big change would be if we have asset managers who are managing listed securities. They're currently not VAT registered per the Act, but there is the possibility of removing that exemption. So that is also in the asset management industry, in the investment and financial services space, that would be a significant adjustment. Yes.
The final question then to you, Chantel, is, the word sovereign fund has been doing rounds now since the Geingob administration took office. And the minister just mentioned that it's now going to be called the Welwitschia Fund. Would you care to share with our viewers on whether Namibia can, what can Namibia benefit from a fund of that nature, and if possible, how?
Yes, you're quite right. Quite the new, much talked about fund. Yes, so to our viewers, maybe just to dissect it a bit. So a sovereign fund would typically be it's a state-owned investment fund that would have a diverse investment portfolio, whether it's real assets, whether it's financial assets, with a larger focus on offshore or broad investments abroad. So per the global PwC network, we also have a lot of research available in terms of the academic theories on the benefits of having such a fund. So to name just 3 of those would be that it could hold in lower inflation levels for a country once you have you post-establishment of the fund, and it's more established. The second benefit could be also a smaller acceleration of the exchange rate. And then the third one, which I think most of us will be, it's more easier for us in the sense to identify with, is it could lead to enhanced transparency in terms of state affairs as well. So yes, so a lot of conversation yet to go in, and for me and you and our viewers, still a lot to learn. What will be key in our learning on the fund is what is the anticipated revenue streams that will contribute to kickstart the fund, as well as also what will be the structure to the fund and the custodian to the fund and its investment policy. And then thirdly also, so what instances would trigger that we would take from the fund. So if you compare this on a household level where we promote personal spending and saving, so this would be the equivalent at national level as well. So typical events which we've currently had to weather without a fund was recently the impact of the pandemic on Namibia. So any grant, for example, or significant unforeseen, unplanned expenditure needed could be unfortunate events, but could then be weathered or buffered by having a sovereign fund, for example. Yes.
Exciting times, Chantel. So thank you very much for making time, really, and for your insightful presentation. I wish we could continue, but maybe you can share with our viewers where can they find a similar and more detailed presentation on your platforms.
Yes, thank you, Toivo. Thanks for having me. Thank you to our viewers for following the conversation. And as Toivo mentioned, welcome to visit our PwC website, www.pwc.com.na. In terms of where more information to these announcements and allocations is readily available. And other than that, we also just an email away. Thank you.
Wonderful. I appreciate your time. Thank you for coming, Chantel. I appreciate your time. That was Chantel Husselmann. She is a country senior partner at PwC, dissecting what has been a very interesting budget presentation, mid-year budget presentation by Minister Ipumbushimi on the 3rd of November. We are now going to a quick break, and then we'll come back with a conversation with Monique Cloete. Welcome back. In this segment of the show, which is also the last segment of the show, we are welcoming back on the set Monique Cloete. She's Managing Director of Liberty Life Namibia. And again, just for a brief overview, she is a seasoned professional in the employee benefit environment, having spent the bulk of her time in the pension space in various roles, and more recently leading an insurer. Monique, thank you very much for your time again. So thanks for that. I think the first question really is just, in the minister's budget speech, mid-year budget speech, he proposed an increase in the deductibility of pension fund contributions and educational policy premiums to a maximum of $150,000 from $40,000. Just how does this affect or impact the pension industry?
Thank you, Toivo. I think it would be important for us to sketch the current scenario.
Sure.
So at the moment, we have an individual has approximately has $40,000 Namibian per annum that they can pay into a retirement type of product or an education policy for their children, and they can claim that back for tax purposes.
Okay.
So the proposal to grow that is very welcome, to move from the 40 to 150,000 per annum. It's been 40,000 for many, many years. So the proposal is definitely welcomed by industry. But essentially, we've got to look at what would the impact be. So I've brought along a few calculations that I've done.
Yeah.
If a member was to contribute purely into a product, a retirement product, at about 40,000 Namibian dollars per annum, from the age of 21 up to roughly the age of 60, they would have contributed in total about 1.5 million, and that would grow to the region of almost 3 million over that period of about 40 years. And the reason I've used that range is that you would invariably have finished school and potentially have attended about 3 years of tertiary education. If we work on the new maximum proposed by the minister at 150,000 Namibian dollars, you would have contributed in the region of 5.8 million. And that would grow to about 11 million over that period of time. So it's a growth of about fourfold.
Yes.
But we know that this is not the natural progression for every person, because obviously affordability comes into question as well. And there are current structures in place in the country. So we have the opportunity to contribute additionally to employer-sponsored funds that members belong to, or individual type of retirement products as well. If an average Namibian who was earning in the region of about 10,000 Namibian dollars on a monthly basis was to contribute a rate of roughly 11.5%. And that seems to be the average at the moment for contributions that are actually saved for members. So at 11.5%, they would be contributing $1,150 per month. And I've used an average real return of 3%. All right. So over their working life, that would grow to $1 million Namibian dollars, and it sounds like something we could do something with today. However, what the member needs to look at is that even linked to their retirement outcome, okay, or their need in retirement. And the member needs to check what that need will be. So you would look at things like, is my home settled? Do I still have a mortgage that I need to pay while I'm in retirement? Are my children looked after? Are they independent now? Is my vehicle settled? So all of those things people would need to take into account and say, okay, what is my need in retirement? So if I do that and I work on what has generally been accepted to be the requirement. So there was research done by South African National Treasury, and they talk about people replacing their salary in retirement with about 70% of their salary. Okay, so if you were earning 10,000 Namibian dollars, you would need a pension of roughly 7,500 to be able to maintain your standard of living. Now that varies based on how your employer has structured your package, so what is pensionable within your package, and that's something that's very specific to different employers. But as a rule of thumb, we sort of work on the 75%. So in my example, the person earning 10,000 Namibian dollars would have to draw a pension of roughly 7,500 from the age of 60. And I've worked on a life expectancy up to about 90. So if you look at published life expectancy for Namibia, it's probably not that high. But we have seen that with medical advancements, people are starting to live longer. So it's definitely having an impact. I mean, we're seeing an increase in the number of centenarians. I mean, they're published in the newspaper on a regular basis, Toivo. So, and according to the experts, the first person who will become 150 years old has already been born. So we're starting to have to survive a lot longer with money that we've saved in a short period of time. So if that person now looks at what their requirement is, and as I say, I've used the age of 90, their requirement would be roughly 2 million Namibian dollars today, about 1.8 today. So they'd have to contribute additionally. And that would fall specifically in this range that the minister is now making available. But Toivo, if I had to ask you whether you thought about retirement at the age of 20,
never.
Never, okay? and that's probably the answer you'll get from just about everybody.
Yes.
So we generally start thinking about it as we get to our late 30s, early 40s, that's sort of the timeline.
Yes, yes.
So I've brought along a visual to just show what the impact would be if this individual didn't start saving additionally at age 21, but only from age 40.
Yes.
And they would have to contribute 35% of their salary from age 40 to 60 to reach the same point in retirement.
Yeah.
So it has a very big impact on the individual.
Yeah, yeah.
It has a big impact on affordability the later you start the saving. I think also it's important that people do assess what that need is while they're employed, what the retirement need is, and that they start working towards that during their employment period. If we look at the levels that have been set by the minister, it does start to come into play for somebody sitting at a salary level of roughly 30,000 Namibian dollars based on my assumptions. But it's important that regardless of what the salary level is, that we need to start thinking about what the requirements are and start saving for that.
Indeed.
And I think it does, obviously what is being promoted in this is a growth in national savings that can really assist our economy. So I would definitely challenge those of us who have assessed and understand that there is going to be a shortfall, that we start looking at making use of the opportunity that's now available.
Indeed. Thanks for that elaborate answer, Monique. Another thing that the minister touched on was the proposed amendment regarding the VAT now being levied for all asset managers, including listed managers. How do you anticipate the impact will be for average Namibian pension fund members?
So, Toivo, the two main contributors to what you will generate or accumulate for retirement is really your contributions and your investment returns. And over time, the bigger portion of that becomes your investment returns. So if I look at this increase in cost, essentially, I imagine it will be passed on to members. So the fee will now the fee that was there before will now just grow with its VAT. And that will result in a reduction in yield in terms of what investment return is being allocated to members. So again, I've just added, I've just brought along a slide to show you that if that 15% is applied directly onto a member, it is a 15% on the investment fee over 40 years. And that impact is roughly 130,000 on a member's saving. Okay, so the 1.8 million that this member now needed at retirement is reduced, and they can achieve 1.6.5 million. All right. So if they were to contribute additionally to reach the 1.8 million again, it would now have to be a contribution of 40% of salary from the age of 40. So it's important that members also look at what is the reduction in their investment returns, what is the reduction in yield that is applied for additional fees, and that members start demanding transparency around these things. Every additional cost that you have results in a smaller benefit being produced at the end of the day. And that's important for people to note.
Indeed. Monique, you've mentioned the reduction on pension benefits. Have you seen this happen because of increase of domestic asset requirements? Just bear with me. So have you seen this happen because of the increase of domestic asset requirement having been increased historically to a massive 45% locally?
Toivo, it's a tough question to answer. I think what's important for us to realize is over time, we've seen structural changes in the whole industry. So historically, actuaries actually had a rule of thumb that you would need to contribute roughly 15% of your salary in order to maintain your standard of living in retirement.
Yeah.
That has subsequently changed.
Yeah.
So you would need to, at this point in time, the rough estimate is you'd need to be contributing about 20%. And that's because we've seen, I mean, who can remember the time when inflation was sitting at 16%?
Yeah.
You know, it's many, many years ago.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of work done by our South African counterparts. They've put an inflation band in place, and they're starting to sort of maintain it between that 3% and 6%. Namibia has followed suit. We've maintained inflation pretty well.
Yeah.
And that leads to a lower investment interest rate environment and lower investment returns naturally. So the investment returns that our members would have seen many, many years ago are very different to what our market looks like today.
Yeah.
So that's one aspect of it. And I think and the reason I mention that is because a member who is turning 60 within the next year still remembers investment returns of 20% and 25% a year.
Yeah.
And what we've seen more recently, even pre-COVID, is that 12% per annum is actually very, very good. So those, it's almost a mind shift that members need to make around this. And I think the other portion is the basics around supply and demand. So if we look at our industry, we've got the long-term insurers are sitting on assets of about 70 billion.
Yeah.
Okay. Our retirement fund industry is sitting on about 200 billion in assets.
Okay.
All right. So if we look at retirement funds purely, because there would be some double counting, some of their money is sitting in long-term insurance policies. So 45% of the 200 billion now needs to remain in Namibia.
Oh, I see.
Okay. So 90 Namibian dollars has to find a home locally. All right. We've also got quite an illiquid market. We've got very few Namibian listed shares, and we have a limitation on investments in dual listed shares that may not exceed 10%. So where does this money find its home? It's going to find its home in local property, local bonds, local cash. Demand is going to exceed the supply of these products, and essentially it's going to drive prices up. So obviously buying more expensive securities, your investment return is going to be suppressed. From a retirement fund point of view, trustees who manage these funds are placed in a position of trust. They're placed there as fiduciaries. And the law expects that they must be more careful with somebody else's money than with their own. They have a responsibility to act with due care, and they have a responsibility to act in good faith. And many trustees are very hesitant about the changes in the investment regulations in the asset allocation because their concern is about generating investment returns for members. In our pension fund industry, we have two defined benefit funds, which is the GIPF and Rossing Pension Fund, and then the rest of the industry is defined contribution. So your benefit is purely determined on what you've contributed and the investment returns. That's really the crux of it. And trustees have this inherent conflict in their role since they are looking after member money, and therefore have this almost unspoken pressure to deliver high investment returns for members. So I think that's the conflict we've got to try to align. I understand the intention of the legislation, and I buy into it. We've got to try and invest in our own communities. We've got to try and build our economy locally. We saw it happening during COVID-19. Our infrastructure suffered, our healthcare sector suffered. I had a colleague who, during that period of time, and I'm sure there are many stories like this, a colleague who took his dad to hospital because he was struggling to breathe and they had no place for him. So we saw, we ran out of oxygen at some point in time. And there are many more stories like this. Family members having to fly a spouse or a parent to a different town across the country because that was where a hospital bed was available. So I see the link between this increased local requirement and the growth of in infrastructure in our country.
Yeah, indeed.
But I think it's about getting that alignment of what is the trustee's role and how much protection do they need to put in place for their members, and getting over that line, I think, is the challenge that we have.
Very important. Chantel, we have 8 minutes of our exciting conversation. You just touched a little bit on the subject of COVID-19, how it battered families and some of the members of these funds. How have you experienced this pandemic and its effect on your customers since it started? And how do you think that this has actually affected our economy in general?
Toivo, this is very topical for us as insurers. I must say, I think people are all COVIDed out at this point. People are tired.
Yes.
You can almost see the joy as things are being opened up and curfew is taken away and so forth. But I think, I mean, as I look at 2020, when this started, COVID was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization in March of 2020. And as at the 10th of November this year, we have worldwide 250 million confirmed cases and in excess of 5 million deaths reported.
Yeah.
And we know that those statistics are not accurate.
Yes.
We know that they're understated.
Yes.
But I think for Namibia, COVID has been a tale of two parts in essence. When I was asked at the end of 2020, you know, what was the impact of COVID on your business? I said, well, it was economic.
Yeah.
We had our hard lockdown start in March of 2020. As Chantel mentioned earlier as well, there was a stay in our tourism and our hospitality sector. We didn't have tourists coming in anymore. So that really hit the economy very, very hard.
Yeah.
Not that we were in a good place prior to COVID. I mean, we were struggling before that. And I think COVID exacerbated it.
Yeah.
But in 2020, we saw the impact of retrenchments, yes. And we saw that hit the insurance industry, very definitely. But the economic effect was more than the mortality effect. And I suppose at the end of December 2020, we sort of looked at COVID and said, well, you know, it's over, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, are we even going to see this thing going forward?
Yeah.
And then 2021 happened. And we started 2021 almost at the peak of wave 2. And you know, we saw more retrenchments coming through in Namibia, you know, closing down or being liquidated at that point in time. We ended December 2020 with 205 deaths in Namibia.
Yeah. Oof. Huge numbers.
At the end of March 2021, we had 523 deaths. Oof. At the end of June this year, we had 1,521.
Yeah.
And at the end of September, we have 3,511. And I'd like to show you the impact of just what it looks like. On the next slide, what we've put together is just the 7-day moving average of our confirmed cases. So you'll see we increased a little bit July, August. Then we had, that was the first wave. We had wave 2 in December and January this year. And look at the vast impact that wave 3 caused in our country. And that's why I think it's really the mortality impact is what we felt in 2021. I can share with you from an insurer's point of view that June, July and August were probably the months where we paid out the most death claims in that period of time. Even the team that we dealt with was under pressure. The claims team within our organization was struggling.
They were overwhelmed.
We were paying out in terms of numbers triple the number of claims that we would pay out on a normal basis. So I think the impact of the mortality effect in 2021 is really what we've started to feel COVID's impact in the country, and not just from a cost point of view, from a claims point of view, but looking in the newspapers at the time and seeing how many death notices we saw in the papers, people we knew, people who were very skilled.
Exactly.
We've lost the economic value of those individuals. We've lost the skills. Just taking into account, you know, I suppose when you look at a death in general, the real challenge is about how we mourn the potential of the individual and what they would have achieved, I suppose. And that's going to take us time. You know, you can't recover those kind of skills immediately. So I think that's going to be a challenge for us. I think the one thing that for me was encouraging is insurance has always been, and I'm sure you don't like paying for insurance either, Toivo.
I don't.
But insurance has always been a grudge purchase, right? We don't like taking it, but we do. And I think what was encouraging for me during this period was not just looking at this is the value we're paying out, or this is the number of claims that we're paying out, but looking at how we were able to impact families and really assist them in providing a dignified burial, assist children in having an education where they'd been orphaned, perhaps. Those type of situations is really what brought almost perspective, I suppose, to what we were doing.
Thanks, Monique. In closing, and briefly, if you can, how do you see the post-COVID work in your environment?
Toivo, a post-COVID world, I'm not even sure I can imagine it at this point. I think there's sort of three things that come to mind for me. So the first one would be the effects that we're still going to see of long COVID. People experiencing symptoms, still having extreme fatigue months after having been diagnosed, people still struggling with dyspnea, shortness of breath for a long period after that. And I think that's going to really impact us. I think that's something we've got to be aware of and prepare ourselves for. I think the other challenge that we have is vaccination hesitancy. I think that's a big challenge for us. I've checked some of the statistics across Africa, looking at our neighbors, and we are the slowest in terms of uptake. If we look around our borders, we are the slowest in terms of vaccination levels, and I think that's a challenge. I'm sure you know as well. There are lots of conspiracy theories around it, and social media has been good for us in some things and bad in others, because I think it has helped that. I do believe, though, we have seen the statistics in our country, provided by the Ministry of Health, that vaccinations do reduce the chance of hospitalization. So it is something that and I mean, there's encouragement from the ministry, but it is something we've got to really push as a nation, because I think that'll help us get to this post-COVID world that we'd like to see. And then I think lastly, something that we've got to think about is this new way of living. You know, we all picked up our bags and we went home on the 28th of March last year, and slowly people, and it was an adjustment, and now slowly people are starting to move back to the office, and that's another adjustment. So I think some sort of hybrid, and I suppose for me, some of the things I'm thinking is, you know, we've proven that digital works in that period of time. So where do we as humans, where do we add the most value? It's really in us being human. Indeed. Computers can do a lot of things nowadays. So how do we use our people where they're needed to be human? And I think that's probably some of the thought process, and I think it'll be a hybrid, not even just between different entities. I think within one entity, you'll find a hybrid working model that we'll probably look forward to.
Indeed. I've said that COVID-19, there are some routines that we must retain going forward. And I think even that hybrid concept that you're talking about, I think it's something that will benefit employees and employers going forward. So I think if there was any silver lining in this whole COVID pandemic, is that we've learned some lessons, some of which we must retain even after the pandemic is over. Yes. So I agree with you there. Monique, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show tonight, this morning. Thanks not only for your time, but also for your very insightful presentation.
Thank you very much, Toivo. It's been a pleasure, and thank you to the viewers for sharing their time with us.
Sure, indeed. That is Monique Cloete. She is Managing Director of Liberty Life Namibia, sharing with us her interpretation of Minister Ipumbu Shimi's media budget as tabled on the 3rd of November. Thank you for watching, and have a wonderful weekend ahead.
While Namibia and its cities are seen as one of the cleanest countries in Africa, plastic pollution is a big problem. Therefore, it's up to each of us to do what we can to reduce the use of plastic, especially single-use plastic bags. At Liberty Life Namibia, we've taken the decision to turn all our old branding items into reusable shopping bags. It's a way in which we can drive sustainability and look after our most important stakeholder, our environment. If you also believe in sustainability and would like more information, please get in touch. Liberty Life Namibia. In it with you.
A lot has changed in the past 160 plus years, but the world is evolving faster every day. Founder Samuel Lowell Price's version of a self-driving car was a really smart horse. Who knows how our great-grandchildren will get around? Here at PwC, we know we're responsible for guiding our people, clients, and communities through this constant change. How do we engage the more than 220,000 people across 157 countries in the PwC network? Through a clear and simple purpose, to build trust in society and solve important problems. What that really means is, in between our morning coffees and our evening commutes home, we all live and breathe the same core values. Here they are, the 5 things that make us, us. We act with integrity. We speak up for what's right, even when it's the harder option. We make a difference. We stay informed and proactively look for ways to better our world. We care about each other, about our clients and stakeholders, about empowering everyone to do their best. We work together. We know feedback, collaboration, and diverse perspectives help us deliver the highest quality outcomes. We reimagine the possible. Nothing great ever